Dr. Reba, our assistant professor of medicine and medicine 2 and clinical epi, she's going to take sessions on grade. Today we're going to take what is grade and part 1 of grade, and the next Saturday we'll take part 2 and part 3 of grade. It's called core grade, and Reba will explain what they are. So anybody interested in evidence-based medicine? Grade is a new hot topic, not new, it's been around for a while, but it's sort of being summarized right now by Reba. So without much ado, over to Reba.
Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be looking at understanding core grade approach, part 1. Just to introduce you to important figures, this picture here on the left is Dr. Gordon Guyatt, who coined the term evidence-based medicine. And on the right, we have another famous person called David Sackett. He was a pioneer of evidence-based medicine. Dr. David Sackett was Dr. Gordon's mentor, and they both worked in the McMaster University in Canada. So Dr. Gordon Guyatt, he coined the term evidence-based medicine, which was first published in JAMA in the year 1992. And he's also contributed significantly to the very important influential discourse on how to use research evidence for clinical practice, the User's Guide to the Medical Literature, which is actually there in our table right now. And he also played a very important role in developing systematic processes to look at RCTs, to look at systematic reviews, as well as the clinical practice guidelines. And that's summarized in the GRADE handbook under Cochrane. And he's also developed a Magic App platform, which allows authors to write and publish the guidelines and evidence summaries in a highly structured fashion using the GRADE methodology. So we all know that the best evidence actually comes from systematic reviews. And this GRADE, it stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, Evaluation. It's a systematic approach to rate the certainty of evidence in systematic reviews and other evidence synthesis. So it gives its output in two important forms. One is it looks at the quality of the body of evidence, and it also looks at the strength of recommendations. So based on the quality of the body of evidence, it automatically feeds into the strength of recommendations. So if you look at the final output for the certainty of evidence, you can have high quality evidence, you can have a moderate quality evidence, and you can have a low quality evidence, and it could be very low. So if it's high, your final interpretation is that the intervention reduces or increases the outcome. If the certainty of evidence is moderate, then you must use the phrase probably. The intervention probably reduces or increases the outcome. And if the certainty of evidence is low, the intervention may reduce or increase the outcome. And if it's very low, you must mention that the quality of evidence is very uncertain. So if you look at the initial grade, you have RCTs and you have non-randomized studies. So this pointer is not working. We'll just go on the pointer, some issues are there. So if you look at the bodies of evidence, on the top we have randomized studies, and the bottom we have non-randomized studies. So randomized studies always start off with a very high certainty of evidence. And non-randomized studies innately starts off with very low quality of evidence. But suppose the authors have used the Robin's-Eye tool for non-randomized studies, you can also give it a high quality of evidence. Then the next step is 5 domains can actually rate down your certainty of evidence. It could be any risk of bias in the individual studies. There can be inconsistency in the results of individual studies. The overall results can be indirect. There could be some imprecision, or there can be some publication bias. These are domains which will actually rate down the certainty of evidence. And you have few domains which rate up the certainty of evidence, especially for cohort studies. For example, if you have a large dose response, if you have a large effect, you could have a dose response curve. Or if you have any opposing residual confounding also can rate up your certainty of evidence. And finally, you come up with the final result, which can be high, moderate, low, or very low certainty of evidence. So the quality of the studies are given on the left. The study designs are given in the middle column. You can see that RCTs, as I told, has high certainty of evidence. And you can lower the quality by either 1 or 2 if the study has a risk of bias. For inconsistency also, you can lower it by 1 or 2. For indirectness also, you can note by 1 or 2. For imprecision also, you can note down by 1 or 2. Today, I'll be talking more about imprecision. The other 4 domains, I'll be talking in more detail over the coming weeks. And if you have an observational study which starts off with a very low quality of evidence, you can increase the quality by 1 or 2 for a large effect. If you have a dose response benefit, you can increase it by +1. If you have any, the confounding, if it's actually opposed to your final result also, you can increase it by 1. Then the final grade recommendations, we use 2 terms. It can be either strongly against or strongly for a particular intervention. It can be weakly against or weakly for a particular intervention. The WHO has now replaced the word weakly with the use of the word conditional. So this grade has been widely adopted by many systems. For example, the Cochrane Evidence Synthesis and Methods, the BMJ journal, the UpToDate, the WHO organizations, all of them use this particular grade for their appraisal or systematic reviews. So now why do we need co-grade? So the problem with the original grade is it has become very complex and poorly organized over times, because there's been sequential publication of many papers. Almost 50 papers have been published since the first introduction of grade. Then the next problem was, many of the terms have become very complex. So co-grade was actually developed to simplify and consolidate the existing grade. And they wanted us to find all the information in one series of papers instead of referring back to all the previous set of papers. And it basically makes it very streamlined. It takes only the essential components of the main grade, which you need for rating the evidence certainty. And it also helps us in moving from the evidence to the recommendations. So here they have published why co-grade is needed. If you're interested, you can go and look at this article. So who is this co-grade for? It's for people interested in doing a systematic review. It's very important for people who are developing guidelines, and also for health technology assessment practitioners. And it's also useful for us clinicians to guide our clinical care. So the main principles are, it's very flexible to use, it's simple, and it's also practical. And it gives a lot of importance to the values and preferences of individual patients. So if you look at the overall series, there are 7 papers. So the first paper addresses the overview of the co-grade approach. The second paper looks at the target of certainty and assessing the imprecision. The third paper looks at assessing inconsistency. The fourth paper looks at the risk of bias, the publication bias, and the reasons for rating up of certainty. Fifth paper is concerned with assessing the indirectness. Sixth paper looks at the overall summary of findings table. And the seventh paper actually helps us to move from evidence to recommendations and decision making. So today we'll be looking at the first and the second paper. So this is the first paper, co-grade 1, which is the overview of the co-grade approach. So it has 5 sections. First is about formulating the research question. The second is refining the research question. Third is the possible need for indirect evidence. Fourth is the grades rating of certainty of evidence. And fifth is actually completing the grade process. So now if you look at this overview schematic use of co-grade, on the left we have a systematic review, and on the right we have the guideline development. So this can be done independently, or they can also be done together. So in a systematic review, if you're using the grade, it helps you to formulate the questions, the PICO of your study. It helps you in identifying the important outcomes. For in this hypothetical situation, we have 6 outcomes. And it helps us to give the rate the importance of each of these outcomes. And finally, use the meta-analysis to synthesize the evidence, and you get an output. You get findings for each outcome. And with the help of grade, you actually determine the certainty of evidence. Now, what do the guideline developers do? So when they make guidelines, they actually have a clinical question. So they also formulate a PICO, for which they use grade. And then the methodology team does the systematic review. And based on the effect of estimate, the decision makers have to decide, is it beneficial or is it harmful? They also look at the objective evidence, that is the certainty of evidence, and decide on their final guidelines. They also look at individual values and preferences. So every guideline development body has patient representatives also. And they also look at the overall resources, the feasibility, the acceptability, the equity, and they come up with your recommendations. So let's go on to the first part, that is formulating the research question. So we look at the population intervention comparison, and we look at the rating the importance of outcomes. So the target PICO. So when we formulate the target PICO, we must give a lot of thought about the formulation of each element. We have to make sure it's as specific and precise as possible, and to avoid ambiguity. So they usually actually recommend when you're doing systematic review or doing a guideline development to actually have a grade expert who can help you formulate a good PICO. And especially when you have guideline developers, they usually have a steering group, which actually translates the broad questions of guideline development into specific target PICOs. So just an example, this is like the difficulties in choosing a population. So when the WHO came up with the management of sepsis guidelines, they had some issues in defining the sepsis populations. So the problem is various definitions of sepsis exists, and each individual trial actually uses different definitions of sepsis. Then the next question they had is, whom does this guideline refer to? Does it refer to patients who present at the time of admission to the hospital? And how long do you define this time of presentation? Do you define it for 24 hours or do you define for 48 hours? And could the population include those not admitted with sepsis, but who developed sepsis while in the hospital? And even in terms of intervention, how long do you define the intervention? Like, do the patients get intervention throughout the stay in the ICU or throughout the hospital stay or some shorter time frame? So very important to actually clarify everything ahead of starting of the systematic review each term. The next important thing is rating the importance of outcomes. So it's very important that we identify all the outcomes that are potentially important to patients. So when the guideline panels, when they do this, they actually undertake a structured process to rate the importance of potentially relevant outcomes. Sometimes they use a 9-point scale, where if they give 7 to 9, it becomes a critical outcome. If they give a score of 4 to 6, it becomes an important but not a very critical outcome. And if it's 1 to 3, it's an unimportant outcome. So ideally, when they do this, they should actually be informed by systematic reviews of patient values and preferences. And if they have time, it's better they do a focus group discussion with patients to decide what the patients think are the most important outcomes. An example of doing this is actually when the WHO came out with their COVID guidelines. So here they have a section, multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children with COVID-19. So before they go ahead with looking at whether steroids are actually useful for these patients, they have actually called the patients and they have asked them to, they've given them an exercises for them to prioritize the outcomes. And the patients and their parents have actually given the scores for each of these outcomes. So for them, death was an important score. Need for invasive mechanical ventilation was an important score. Things which were important but not critical was maybe the duration of hospitalization, the length of stay in the PICU. Yeah. So if you look at this hypothetical situation also here, out of the 6 outcomes, the 2 of them have been rated as critical outcomes, 2 of them have been rated as important outcomes, and 2 have been rated as not very important outcomes. So when you do the systematic review, you actually only target the critical as well as the important outcomes, and you don't have to pay much attention to the not important outcomes. So the next example I would like to tell you is the importance of outcomes also differs across the stages of illness. Now, for example, if you patients with COVID can be admitted in the ward, there can be outpatient COVID-19 patients, or there can be patients who don't have COVID, but they've got the vaccine. So patients in the hospital who are admitted with COVID, for them, the most important outcomes would probably be mortality, for them, the need for invasive ventilation, or the duration of hospital admission. Suppose you're an outpatient, you're probably worried whether you need to be admitted in the hospital. And if you don't have COVID, you're worried whether you'll actually get a symptomatic COVID. So the next problem is actually choosing the relevant time frame of outcome assessment. So going back to the same sepsis guidelines, they had interventions of steroids, inotropes, different starting times for antibiotics. The outcomes they looked at were mortality, adverse effects of treatment, as well as functional recovery. Now, the time frame is, do you assess all these outcomes while the patient's in the hospital, or do you assess the outcomes 1 month after the hospital admission, or should you use a longer time frame, 6 months? So finally, here the panel has decided that they will use the primary outcome as 28 days after the hospital admission, and the secondary interest as 6 months post-hospital admission. So now that we have looked at all the difficulties, challenges while defining the PICO, the next thing you have to look at is refining the question. So the next thing is, you must understand that the effect of the treatment will actually differ across population, intervention, or outcome characteristics. I will explain in detail. Before that, I like to digress a bit by defining an effect. A binary outcome is when the outcome is either yes or no. For example, is a mortality, is a patient alive or dead? It's a yes or no outcome. So if you have a relative effect, it will either be a relative risk, odds ratio, or hazard ratio. If you want to express the same thing in absolute effect, you will talk about absolute risk difference or number needed to treat. So let's have a show of hands. How many of you think that relative effect is important to the patient? Okay, how many of you think that absolute effect is important to the patient? Okay, so I'll just explain this. So suppose you come across an ad which tells this pot of face cream reduces wrinkles in 50% women by 2 months, and 20 grams of that costs about rupees 5,000. Do you think it's worth buying it or not? Okay, so if you actually look at their evidence, so in women not using the cream, 1 out of 100 had fewer wrinkles after 2 months. In women using the cream, 2 out of 100 had fewer wrinkles. So the absolute difference is just 1%. But if you say it as a relative effect, you will say that there is actually 0.5 times decrease. That's a 50% extra benefit. You can see how the numbers actually change based on what kind of effect you actually take. Let's look at another example. Here we have a 20-year-old with no comorbidities. Here we have an elderly man with multiple comorbidities. You give them both the same intervention. And for both of them, the overall mortality reduced by 50%. But if you notice, here the baseline risk for this young man is only 2%. Baseline risk for this elderly man with multiple comorbidities is actually 40%. So even though your intervention had reduced the mortality rate by 50%, finally here your absolute improvement is only 1% and here it's 20%. So whom do you think will actually benefit from this intervention? The elderly man. So even though the relative effects are similar, the absolute effect of the intervention is different and both have different baseline risk. So this actually comes to the next. That is, the effect of the treatment will actually differ across your baseline population based on what intervention you use and based on what outcome characteristics that you assess. So patient characteristics which will actually affect is probably your age, what baseline severity of illness that you have, what is the socioeconomic status, what's the comorbidity that the patient has. Intervention, how it affects your effect would be, maybe the doses in different studies are different and the duration of administration. And outcome characteristics also will depend on how you define your outcomes. And each of them might be following up, the follow-up time for outcomes might be different. So all of these will actually affect the effect of your treatment. So guideline panels, they must actually specify, before they do the study itself, they must actually specify subgroups whom they're interested in. And they should also tell you the direction of the effect in them. A good example of this is again in the WHO guidelines for COVID, where they wanted to look at the nirmal-travel ritonavir in patients with non-severe COVID-19. So here they have a population that is non-severe COVID-19 patients. They have an intervention where they give this drug. They have a comparison, which is the standard care. And they have outcomes, which is mortality, ventilation, and adverse effects. So here they have mentioned that the groups whom they think that will have a better beneficial effect would be the ones with a larger baseline risk. And who are the patients with larger baseline risk? Immunocompromised patients, patients with chronic disease, patients who have a negative serology, as well as unvaccinated patients. So here they have also mentioned the subgroups. They have also mentioned the overall effect in the treatment. Okay. So different recommendations also exist for people with different baseline risk. For example, a recommendation can favor a drug if the patient has a higher risk, or it can be against an intervention if the patient has a lower risk. So for example, in the same study, they found that the hospital admissions in the low risk was decreased only by 0.4%, and in the high risk, it decreased by 5%. So what they have told is, for patients with non-severe COVID-19 at high risk of hospitalization, they have a strong recommendation to give this drug. On the other hand, patients with non-severe COVID at low risk of hospitalization, they have not recommended the drug, and it's a conditional recommendation. So now, it's also important to know that sometimes we might not have direct evidence for all our outcomes. So for example, in the beginning of COVID, no one had data on whether steroids were useful for COVID-19. But they actually extrapolated the data from ARDS due to other causes and used. So we should also keep in mind that not all the time is possible to have indirect evidence. So now if you look at the co-grades approach to rating of certainty of evidence, it's very similar to the grade, where RCTs have high certainty, observationals have low certainty of evidence. The only difference is, for rating up the evidence, they have removed the confounding domain. They have only kept the dose response and large effect. So they've actually simplified it. So if you find in any domain that there is no major issues, you can say there's no limitations. If you find some mild, some problems, you can say it is not serious, but you don't have to downgrade the overall certainty of evidence. If you find some serious issues in any of the domains, like in imprecision or anything, you can rate down by 1. And if you have very serious issues, you can rate down by 2. And based on that, you'll find you have very low, moderate, and high certainty of evidence. This is just an example of the systematic review which I had appraised last week. where we looked at antibiotic prophylaxis for patients with pregnant patients to see if their overall maternal sepsis came down. Here you can see that they have given a certainty of evidence table where they have incorporated the grade, and they have also looked at the certainty of evidence, that is moderate certainty, high certainty of evidence. So actually, if you look at the systematic review team, when they actually present the data to the guideline development, they're going to show you the summary of findings table, and the guideline development will look at the benefits and harms, the overall certainty of evidence, and then they'll finally formulate the recommendations. So this is the overview of the core grade 1 paper. Now we look at the core grade 2 paper where you actually define two things. You look at the target of certainty rating, and you also see how to rate certainty of evidence if there is any imprecision. Okay. Okay, so I thought there'll be interns here. So I just want to know what is the name of this plot. It's actually a forest plot. So if you look at it, this is the line of null effect, and this is the horizontal axis. So the horizontal axis basically has your scale for statistics, either odds ratio, relative risk in this case. And from individual studies, you have the estimates from each individual study, and you have a final pooled estimate. So the studies which are near 1, it neither favors one particular intervention or doesn't favor the other intervention. Studies more towards one side actually favors that particular intervention. So when you look at the outcome, you want to know what is your interest in assessing an intervention. Do you only want to see if there is an effect or not? For example, does it outperform alternatives such as your existing standard of care or any other existing treatment? Or the other thing you might be interested in, if there is an effect, is it important? Sometimes minimal effects might not really translate to clinical importance. So if you're just looking for an effect, you just take the threshold of null effect, that is that single line. If you're looking for an important effect, then you must use this minimal important difference. So look at this picture. This central line is actually the null effect. If your estimate falls on this side, it means there's a benefit. If your estimate falls on this side, it means there is a harm. What is minimal important difference? You must actually, before you start the study, you must actually tell what is your target for importance. You might say, okay, 25% benefit is my threshold, or 25% harm is my threshold. So that entire range becomes your minimal important difference. If your estimate falls above the threshold for minimal important difference, then you say it has some benefit. If it falls on this side of harm threshold, then you say there is some harm. But if your estimate falls anywhere in this orange line, you say that there is no important benefit. Similarly, you can also define thresholds for moderate benefit and thresholds for large benefit, as well as thresholds for moderate harm, as well as thresholds for large harm. So the first step is you choose the threshold of interest. If you're looking at the importance of the effect, you choose MID, that is minimal important difference. If you're only seeing if there is a true effect, like is there a benefit or a harm, you choose null. Then using the meta-analysis, we get the absolute effect. And we must also choose a target or certainty based on point estimate. And this must be done actually a priori before you actually proceed with your entire exercise of doing a meta-analysis. So for a null, if the point estimate is very near null, you say there is no difference. If it falls on either side of null, you say that's a non-null effect. For MID, if the point estimate is greater than MID, you say important effect. If it is within that MID threshold, you say there is no difference. So look at this picture. Do you think A is important or not important? It is important, even if you choose the MID threshold or the null effect. But what about B? So it depends. So if you have the null effect, B is important. But if you use the MID threshold, then B becomes an unimportant estimate. Okay. So next step is, now that we know how an estimate is, next, how do you actually grade on for imprecision? So all meta-analysis will provide you with a confidence interval, which is basically the bound within 95% of the time you'll get the same result. So the confidence interval width actually gives you key information about the extent of imprecision. The more bigger the confidence interval, the less precise is your result. So look at this flow chart. So first you have to look at the confidence interval of your result. If it doesn't cross any of the thresholds, for example, look at A, the result of A, it doesn't cross the upper limit and the lower limit of the confidence interval doesn't cross your MID threshold. If you have a moderate effect, you don't rate down. If you have a large effect, it's also a problem. I will explain that later. But suppose your confidence interval, for example, in B as well as C, it crosses your threshold for MID, then you must rate down for imprecision. Okay, so rating down for imprecision also depends on the choice of your MID. So for example, in this picture, where you're looking at a systematic review to see if you should give corticosteroids in patients that come into acquired pneumonia. Suppose you have chosen that I want a 10% benefit. Do you think this, should you downgrade this for imprecision? Yes, you'll downgrade by 1. Suppose you have chosen your MID as 5%. You're looking only for a 5% benefit. Would you downgrade? We won't downgrade. Okay. Now, what if your result actually shows no evidence? Like there's no effect. It's very close to null. How do you grade down for imprecision in this? So in example A, the estimate is actually, there's no benefit, but the confidence interval on both sides actually lies within the threshold for the MID. So here you will not write down for imprecision. But in the second example, here you can see that the confidence, the 95% confidence interval actually crosses the MID for benefit. So there could be some benefit. So here you will rate down the imprecision by 1. Same way in this C, the confidence interval actually goes to the side where there could be some harm. So here also you must downgrade 1 for imprecision. In this last example, on both sides, there could be some benefit, there could also be some harm. So here you must actually downgrade for imprecision by 2. Same way, the previous one, the glucocorticoids, you had some effect. But if you see the confidence interval actually going even to the part where it can cause harm, here also you must downgrade by 2. Okay, so now let's deal with large effects. So in an RCT, it's very unusual that you have large effects. Usually we're looking at effects of less than 30%. But sometimes if you have a relative risk more than 40% or even 30%, then you must look at the overall sample size which the systematic review has considered. So let's look at this example. Here we have a meta-analysis which looks at Ringer's lactate versus normal saline in patients with acute pancreatitis and seeing whether resuscitation with either of them reduces the ICU admission. So you have 3 different studies. You have the overall pooled estimate, which is 0.33, and the confidence interval is 0.13 to 0.81. So overall, it's favoring Ringer's lactate. And the odds ratio is actually 0.33. So it has a large effect. There's a 67% odds reduction in the context of only 26 events overall. The total sample size in the Ringer's lactate is 99. Out of it, only 7 had an effect. 7 had events. And the overall events was only 19 in normal saline with an overall sample size of only 102. So this flowchart also deals with that. So if you have a large effect, the next thing to do is actually calculate the optimal information size. So what is the optimal information size? Like how for individual RCTs, we calculate sample size. For a systematic review, you look at something called the OIS. So you can use hypothesis testing to actually calculate OIS. Some online calculators are this openepi.com. So again, you feed in the values. You can take an alpha error of 0.05, a beta error of 0.2. That means a power of 80%. And your control group event rate. So for example, in this study, your control group event rate is actually how much? 19 divided by 102, which will be about 0.12. And you actually have to substitute a modest risk reduction, like around 20%. If the sample size from your studies is much more than the OIS, then there is no need to downgrade for imprecision. The second step is actually to use figures. So you already have some pre-made figures which gives you varying control group event rate in the x-axis. You have the total sample size required in the y-axis, and you have graphs for each relative risk reduction. So let's look at our example. We have a control event rate of 0.12. Our power is 80%, and we're looking at the second curve. That is the relative risk reduction, 25%. If you see here, our OIS will probably correspond to about 3,000. But in this study, they had taken only 200 sample size. So obviously, we have to downgrade for imprecision in this study. Instead of using sample size, you can also look at the number of events needed. So in this graph, again, looking at a control rate of 0.12, if you're looking at the relative risk rate of 25%, you will need at least 360 events to comment on imprecision. In our study, we had only about some 29 events. So again, you'll downgrade for imprecision. And another very easy method is actually to look at your upper, this is your confidence interval. You look at the upper limit of confidence interval, which is 0.81. You look at the lower limit of the confidence interval, which is 0.13, and divide them. If it is more than 2.5, that means it's extremely imprecise. So in our study, it's actually 6.2, which is larger than the 2.5 limit. So here you will rate down by 2 for the overall imprecision. So basically you look at the upper and the lower limit of confidence interval and you divide it. If it's more than 2.5 for an odds ratio or more than 3 for a risk ratio, then you must downgrade by 2 for imprecision. So that ends how to actually rate down for imprecision. We just look at an exercise. This is what I had done last week also, looking at the antibiotic prophylaxis during labor on maternal mortality. So we had pregnant women in labor after 28 weeks of gestation who were anticipating a vaginal delivery. There was no indication for cesarean section. We gave any antibiotic prophylaxis. We also gave the control as placebo. And we looked at various outcomes. Now, this is the summary of findings table. So let's look at the first outcome, maternal sepsis. The risk with placebo was 18 per 1,000 and the risk with an antibiotic was 12 per 1,000. So overall, the absolute risk reduction was about 6 per 1,000. So the relative effect was 0.65. So here in the study, they had used an MID threshold of 0.75 to 1.25. So would you rate this down for imprecision? They had taken 0.75 to 1.25.
You got 0.56.
Yes, so they have gotten 0.56 to 0.77. However, interestingly, so we could have downgraded by 1, but they actually have not downgraded this for imprecision. They had actually downgraded this for indirectness. Another way to explain this is, suppose your best benefit would be around 44% reduction mortality. Would you still recommend this treatment? For example, if I give you an antibiotic prophylaxis, your overall mortality will actually decrease by 44%. Do you think it's important? Yes. Do you think a 33% reduction mortality is also important? We would anyway recommend it. So then maybe you don't really have to downgrade for imprecision in this because it's just about crossing your MID threshold.
Now we have to see that they have had 42,000 patients. So the OIS is optimal information size is already reached. I mean, so there's a plus minus. As long as you explain why you did and didn't do.
Yeah. So the next outcome, that is maternal mortality. Is it an important is there any effect in this outcome? No. So because your relative effect is only 1.21 and your confidence interval is about 0.63 to 2.33. Would you downgrade this for imprecision? If yes, by how many points? 1 point or 2 points? 2 points, yeah. So if you actually look at the confidence interval, it's extremely wide. It's from 0.63 to 2.33, which comes under the scenario D, where it crosses your MID for benefit as well as MID for harm. So actually there could be some harm, there could also be some benefit. So here actually you have to downgrade by 2. So which the authors have done and they have come with a moderate certainty of evidence for this particular threshold outcome. Yes. Yeah, study is showing there's no benefit. But no, if the study had shown no benefit and the confidence interval threshold was within the MID range, then you don't have to downgrade. But now what happens is, because the confidence interval is so wide, that there's some chance that there could be some benefit, there's some chance that there could also be some harm.
Very important if you see the comment. If you say that the high quality evidence, you say antibiotic will not reduce mortality. But if you say moderate quality evidence, then you write antibiotic is likely to result in little or not. You hedge that answer a little bit. It may not reduce mortality.
Yeah, so because it's moderate, they have used the word likely.
But they have upgraded only by 1.
Yeah.
You know why? 2.3 by 0.6 here? No. The division was
Yes, 2.33 by 0.6.
what is that? 4. No, less than 4. They said 4.
3 was a cutoff.
3 was a cutoff. Maybe more than.
Yeah. Then the next outcome, that is the neonatal sepsis. So that should be, so MID should be, so the question she asked is, how do you actually define MID? Like a mortality of 25% is actually too high to use that as a target threshold. So that's absolutely right. So MID should actually have been defined a priori, and the MID which I may choose may be very different from what the authors have chosen. For me, a mortality of even 5% reduction is good for me, or even 10%. but they've been more lenient in their interval. They've taken actually 25% here and 25% for harm. Yes. Yes. We must set the MID before you do the study. We cannot manipulate it after you get your study results. So for the next outcome, neonatal sepsis, this also shows no effect. It's 1.03. But would you rate this down for imprecision? You will not rate it down because it's 0.96 to 1.1. And similarly, even the neonatal mortality also, you will not rate down for imprecision because the MID threshold is 0.87 to 1.21, which is less than the threshold. Then the last one, the wound infection, they have got a relative risk of 0.8 and they have the confidence interval is actually 0.64 to 0.99. Would you downgrade this for imprecision? This is very similar to the B scenario. You have some effect, but you can see that the upper level of confidence interval actually falls within the MID threshold. So I actually would have downgraded this for imprecision. And even if you look at it the other way, if there is a 36% reduction in perineal wound infection, would you recommend this antibiotic? Yes. But if there is just a 1% reduction in perineal wound infection, you won't really recommend giving antibiotics to all pregnant women. Yes, they have not downgraded it. So this was actually something which I might have downgraded it.
The conclusion is a bit weird.
Mm.
We have high quality evidence that the evidence should have said that it should be given.
Yeah.
But they have put any antibiotic results in little or no difference.
But they probably taken the MID then.
But they should have downgraded it by
Yeah. So this is just a last slide. So this is an under systematic review which looks at endovascular thrombectomy plus or minus IV thrombolysis for patients with acute ischemic stroke at 4.5 hours of presentation. So just look at all the relative effects, that is this column, and see whether you would like to downgrade imprecision for any of these.
That's a good question. What is the MID?
So interestingly, this entire article has not actually, they've not defined an MID. Oh, so the question asked was, what was the MID in this particular systematic review? So the entire authors have not actually, they've not given us an MID threshold.
In which case, it must go by null.
Then you should use a null threshold. And also you must look at the confidence interval and see if anything is too wide. That means none of them actually have any effect, no benefit, none of them. Yes, but when you want to grade it for imprecision, which one would you downgrade anything for imprecision or not?
Yeah. Symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage, 0.84 to 1.7. Seems to be a very wide.
Yes.
That one seems to be rather wide.
Absolutely right. This is the only confidence interval which is actually has a very wide confidence interval. And the authors also have downgraded one level for imprecision because they feel that this 1.7 could be harmful and 0.84 could also, there might be some beneficial. So they have downgraded one for imprecision. So that concludes how do you rate for imprecision. Thank you.